I'm Nate Perkypile. I've been making games for about 18 years now, and about 14 of those years I spent at Bethesda, worked on Fallout 3, Fallout 4, Skyrim, Fallout 76, and Starfield. And now I've gone indie, and I'm doing my own solo indie dev game called The Axis Unseen, and it's a game where you hunt monsters from folklore.
Now that's a lot of AAA titles, Nate. And as we know, AAA titles, there's big teams working on those things, and you're part of a machine when a game is that big. Can you talk about what that experience brought with you in your own game development now that you're a one-man team, essentially, two-man team?
Well, a lot of games were really, really big in AAA, but when I started at Bethesda, at least, we were actually a pretty small team. So one of the things I think I got good at was doing a lot fast. Because like Fallout 3, that was like 60 people, which at the time was pretty small. So a lot of that experience I have building open worlds and rapidly and finding all these tricks has proven like really useful for building my own open world game, which generally people are like, don't do this. But, you know, I've built quite a few of them, so I know lots of tricks on how to do that faster. And that's kind of what I'm used to.
Yeah, a big part of like this your move into indie, like it has been kind of spurred by, if I remember correctly, like the release of Unreal Engine 5. You've been playing around with it a lot during this past year, and like can you talk a little bit about like where you're at right now with the experience that you've had from using UE5 to build your game?
Yeah, I think I wouldn't have built the same game if I was doing UE4, because they've made a whole bunch of changes for open worlds to make them easier. And also they have their whole nanite technology where everything is just like absurdly detailed. But then that, weirdly enough, lets me build it faster because I can just build really high detailed stuff and throw it in the game instead of spending a bunch of time optimizing it. So it's worked out really well to build out my own game pretty fast. And now I'm building like the full open world, not just the prototype level that I've shown before. Like that was to prove out the ideas. And now I'm, you know, scaling it all up big time.
And to go into detail on the Axis Unseen, you finally revealed this game at the very end of 2021, the Axis Unseen. We finally got to see like this thing you'd been teasing for a while, and some of the details behind it. For those who don't know, can you go into more detail on exactly what the Axis Unseen is?
Yeah, so the core idea is like there's all these monsters around the world, and they're kind of weirdly similar. So you're like, why does everyone have like their own werewolves or Bigfoot? So what if there was this world outside of our own that all these monsters come from? And so you go to this place and you're hunting them, but they also hunt you. So you can like follow footprints. You have to pay attention to the direction of the wind. All of those things matter. Kind of like a regular hunting simulator with like deer and stuff, but instead of deer, it's monsters. A
big part of what you mentioned to us previously in the past was this metal-inspired sort of theming and look to the game. Can you talk about that in both the setting and like the game's creatures and the world?
Yeah, I've always liked the feel and tone of heavy metal stuff, but I feel when it comes to it's like a little bit satirical, which is fine in its own way, where it's like everyone's like headbanging and stuff. But to me, this is like the world that I see in my head when I listen to these albums, with like giant skulls and monsters, and a little bit more of a serious bent to it. So I think it's a really good like inspiration piece. And I also think there's a lot of people who are really into metal. So I bring it up all the time. People are like, oh, I love that. I really want to play more metal games, but there's not that much out there.
There's that term, that metal. I like that term. Like, that's so metal. What happened to that term? I missed that term. They should bring that back.
I'm doing my part.
How's it gone? Like, it's been we're coming up on around 6 months since you finally revealed the game, and obviously you were working on it before that. But what's it been like these last 6 months now that it's out there in the wild and people can see what you're doing?
It's really cool to see what people's reactions are and to see like what they react positively to, like seeing what people think about the music, since I got Clifford Meyer from ISIS to do the soundtrack. So that was really exciting to me. And a lot of people have been really into that. So now it's almost exactly a year that I've been working on the game, because I actually revealed it after about working on it for 6 months. So now it all works actually. Now I have like all the systems, and like theoretically you can play all the different parts of it, but I need to build out like the rest of the content. So there's still a lot of work to do.
Yeah, you get your core gameplay loop down and all your systems down, and then it's polish and just tweaking it from there on out. Like, but it's still a ton of work, because it's just basically, last time we talked to, it was you and then one or two freelancers that you hired every now and again for help in the stuff that you're not experts in, right? Like your sound, for example, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it was just the music for my composer, and I had someone do some drawings and stuff. And I've also been messing around lately with like AI to generate concepts, which is fascinating stuff because you can be like, I want a cabin in a foggy forest with fires and horror and like, you know, like HR Giger or something. And then it will generate a bunch of stuff. And you can just keep tuning the keywords and generating stuff. So stuff like that is really cool for a solo dev like me. Like if I was a professional concept artist, maybe that would be like slightly terrifying. But as a solo dev, it's like, oh, I can try out all these different ideas easier by myself without having to throw like 40 grand at somebody to do it.
And it's interesting to see too that like as Unreal Engine has moved into its sort of 1.0 form, the Axis Unseen has actually been one of the things that was featured on there. And what was it like seeing your project show up alongside everything else that Epic and other developers have been doing with this thing?
It was really cool. It was pretty validating that they decided to involve me in that stuff to like talk about all their new features and show it off. Because I think that is kind of what they're going for, is the things that I'm doing, where it's like the democratization of development, where it's easier for someone like me to make something that looks nice. Like, not that indie games look bad or anything, but like you can do so much with that engine and it's super powerful. And I think all those things let people do a ton, and it's definitely working in my opinion.
Is it hard to make your own? Because when you're making a game by yourself compared to like a structured system where there's different teams and producers and people keeping you on track, you set your own milestones. You can shift your own milestones. What are some advantages and disadvantages to that? Because I feel like you can end up, if you're not careful, you can end up like Star Citizen, just indefinitely be in early access and never have any set goals.
I think that's definitely something to be aware of, but I think that's also something that my past experience at Bethesda helped me with, because in a lot of cases there, I did just schedule myself, and those games are infinitely scalable. Like if you wanted to, you could work on an Elder Scrolls game for like 30 years and never run out of stuff to do. So I guess I got used to being like, here's the amount of time I'm going to give myself for something. Well, how much can I get done in that amount of time? Not like, here's what I want to do, and let's find out how long it's going to take. Oh, whoops, now it's 3 months. You do it. Instead, you have to just be like, you have a week for this. What can you do in a week? And it has to fit. And if it doesn't fit, you know, you can slide things around a little bit, but usually there's ways to find out how to do it fast or like fudge the quality. Not to say you're going to do it bad, but there's quicker ways to do things in a lot of cases to make it fit.
Like one of the more interesting things I've seen is, because I do follow you on Twitter and I see the stuff you post, I think one of the funner things is like when you go into like sort of development Twitter, game dev Twitter, and maybe one of the funniest things I've seen in a long time is the concept of dude grass. Could you talk about that a little bit? Yeah,
because basically anytime I was building an environment, I'd be like, oh, I need to like throw a bunch of people around to figure out if the scale is right, because it's really, really easy to make things like way too big. But then I realized that Unreal has this system where you can just like make grass show up on anything, which normally is obviously for grass. But I was like, well, I'm just going to put a scale guy on there so I can see how big the world is in relationship to a person without having to place 1,000 people around. Actually, way more than that. But then I just thought it was kind of funny, and it runs really well because it's designed to run grass, which, you know, normally there's a ton of it. So I just kept turning the number up and up until my computer like almost exploded. My mouse was like going like this, and what I showed was just a fraction of what was actually being rendered to. And like that whole world, it was probably billions of dudes with dude grass everywhere.
Such an interesting thing. Is like a tool that you use to figure out the scale and figure out how to build the world around it. It's one of those things that I imagine like you've kind of figure out as a trick for yourself along the way, only by like actually working on a game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that's your box quote right there, dude grass. You're featuring dude grass.
I'll just leave it in. Like, I'm not going to delete it. It's just like, why are all those people standing around? Don't worry about it.
Don't worry about it. It's part of the dude grass. It's fine.
Yeah, it's like spirits that went to the world on the other side or something. Yeah, sure. Lore.
Let's speak to that, because you are creating your own, instead of having to work with the confine of certain rules or themes that other past games you've worked on have to apply to. You can create your own universe. You're building your own world. What's it been like doing that from your end, from a narrative point?
I really enjoy that part and sort of figuring out what this world is and why it would make sense and how that relates to the real world. It's almost like finding the answers that are already there, because there's this framework of monsters coming to our real world. Like, why? And you just like go through these thought exercises and figure out the world and the lore. And then eventually I'll end up writing a bunch of stuff, or maybe contract out some stuff for the journals that you'll find. Because I have a whole book system too that I've shown a little bit, where you'll like find pages and open up a physical book and like flip through the pages and see drawings that people have done of creatures, things like that.
As far as like the indie game process goes, like you come from a very interesting background where you've been through a lot of AAA development. Is there anything that you would share with like an aspiring indie dev that hasn't had that background? Like anything that you would say to somebody that's like trying to make their own game, trying to start and get into that field, that like it was a hard lesson for you to learn that maybe you could pass along to them?
I was gonna say, I feel like speaking to what you just said, yeah, I feel like especially with when people are describing a game, the first thing they flow to is it's like Skyrim with blank, or it's like Elder Scrolls but blank, you know?
Yeah, don't do that unless you've done an Elder Scrolls maybe. It takes a lot of practice to figure out all of the specifics on that. So I would say in general, just focus on your strengths and try and do something that you can ship, because bringing something to ship, you'll learn a lot. And even something that seems like a small project, there's a lot there.
Yeah, speaking of like, we live in a digital age now. Like when you're making the game now, and obviously it'll be released digitally, but do you have plans for physical release? Have you looked into physical releases? Do you know the process that goes in of printing a disc and having a case and getting everything out that way?
Like I've talked to various publishers and stuff, and it's come up, but I think that would be one of those things. It's like, well, how much interest is there really? And realistically, I would see that as something after the fact, like, oh, if it did really well, then we could do like, limited run games or something like that and put it out. That's the thing that I think makes the most sense. Like on the indie scale, going through the hassle of getting something physical, that's a pretty big leap.
One of the things that fascinates me just about your game in general, and just about open world games or semi-open world games, is the distance between things. I know that's a big deal in design, like how far is too far, how far is too short, and how are you dealing with that in your specific game? Because there's a lot of tracking and coming back to your base and tracking and coming back to your base. Like as you get farther out, it gets more dangerous, but how far is too far? How, talk about that process, just how close everything has to be in terms of that loop of coming back and tracking and not in the risk reward system of going too deep into the wilderness.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. And that's one of those things you have to do to just start playing the game early. And that's why I wanted to build out the whole world and flesh it out with temp stuff, like temp trees and rocks, and start just seeing how that feels and get like, because I actually brought it in initially. And what I did at first when I started testing it, I was like, this doesn't work for this game. Like maybe it would have worked for Skyrim, where you actually do want those distances to be a bit shorter between things. But with the wilderness mattering more and you needed to track, like I needed to get a bit more of like a realistic scale to things. So it is definitely like, bigger than Skyrim, because even though Skyrim seems really big, it's a little bit toy scale in a way. Like it's, I think 5.5 kilometers across. It's like, that's not actually that big. So for a hunting game, it makes sense to have a bit more wilderness. So that is something I'm definitely playing with. And if I need to, I can tune it all too. Like I'm using Houdini and things like that, where I can then auto-populate assets a little bit and adjust it as needed.
Where do you stop? Like, do you have like the bookend where you say, once I get past these particular things, I'm done with the game? Because like I wonder, like in a game, and especially an open world game where you can just continue to fill it with more content and ideas and creatures and objectives ad nauseum, there is that risk of feature creep. And how do you, like, have you considered like where you stop with this game, where you think it's done, and how you get there?
Yeah, that goes back to the production methods that I mentioned, where I essentially have these buckets of time of like, it's about this long for me to build the world itself, this long for all of the locations within it, and this long for all the creatures. Like now that I've finished the systems chunk, those are the major things that are left. So I will fill it with as much stuff as I can in that amount of time. Like there's a minimum there on what I really need of like, oh, I need a certain number of places to go to get the different powers that you can unlock. Like that, I definitely need those, but I'm not that worried about getting that part done. It's more of like, how detailed is it really? And like lived in clutter and like villages. Like, that's where it gets a little bit fuzzy, but that's why it's a sliding scale for me, as opposed to like, let's just keep building it until I think it's cool.
You know, it's funny you bring that up because with larger open world games, there are reusable assets. Otherwise, there's budget and time that goes into that. So you can only have, maybe your producer says, okay, or designer says you can make 5 different rocks, and these rocks have to be reused everywhere, but you can only make 5. We don't have the budget to make 6 or have to make 7. Like for your game specifically, like how many types of trees do you want in the game, and how many are more the realistic approach will you be able to make with a variety of different looks, only making 3 or 4 different trees?
Yeah, I would like to get like unique ones for each biome, but you're right that usually you only make a handful. And if you use stuff well, you don't notice it that much because you can always like rotate them all, scale them.
Rocks
and stuff.
especially can be rotated, so like they're a little easier.
Yeah, and I have a lot of experience in similar stuff too. Like I built a lot of the kits on the Fallout and Skyrim games, like cave kits and building kits and all these other things. So I'm hoping to leverage that to be able to build out towns and stuff. Like, hey, what if I need a log cabin kit? Like I've done that. I've done a few. So I think that will be useful for building out locations. It's kind of like Legos in a way. You're just like jamming stuff together in a lot of different ways to make different things.
Have you had that moment yet when you're making stuff and you're like, oh, well, I think I've made too many of this, but you're like, wait a minute, I'm my own producer. I can decide how many I want. Damn it, I can make 10 of these and not just 8 if I want.
I think
the realization
made a few too many trees actually on my first biome. There's like 10 or 12. And it's like, I don't think you can actually even tell the difference between half of them. I probably should have just done half of this many.
Well, that's interesting though, because like that's the thing. This is not only like new ground for you, but it's also like your own personal project. There's an amount of passion in any game, but when it's your own game, there's even more.
Yeah, definitely. And just trying to constrain myself to some extent. Just keep that forward momentum too, because you could always noodle on trees for like 3 months if you want to. Like it's very easy to do that with like foliage, nature.
There's a great quote. I forget who said it, but it's the absence of limitation stifles creativity. If you have an unlimited game with unlimited time, unlimited budgets, that's going to be it sounds like a dream, but you're going to have more issues with it than if you have, okay, how do we make this in this short amount of time? And sometimes that's when you get your bangers, right? That's where you get your lightning in a bottle, because just all the things lined up right, and you had these limitations and you're able to work with it and make something great. How do you balance that with what you're doing? Like how much, like we talked about a little bit, but how much time is too much time on the trees until you realize that, I probably could have made only half of those, or environments or enemies or abilities?
I think it's just that most things that I'm trying to do, none of them are more than like a week. So
a 7-day turnaround. I like it.
Pretty much. Unless it's like chunks of something larger, like, hey, I'm doing a whole region. Then it's like, yeah, that's more than a week. But even then, I'm giving myself like 3 weeks. So it's like a week to build the art and stuff, and then 2 weeks to build out the actual region. Like I'll build a little test area in the first week. And that's totally doable though, because like a lot of those areas that I showed in the initial trailer where there's like all these different biomes, each one of those I did in like a day. It's pretty easy to do stuff fast in Unreal.
Is it difficult when working with, we talked about this a little bit, but I'm gonna emphasize more on it. When you're working with yourself and a couple freelancers, you're very specific in what you're doing. When you come from a bigger background working in an environment, you can usually message somebody or walk to a cubicle and be like, hey, I'm having trouble doing this. And you have that kind of team problem solving effort here. Do you still have that by yourself, or I'm assuming you reach out to friends and colleagues if you're having a problem and they chime in, but what's that process like? I
suppose that's usually Google, like something UE4 or UE5 broke. See what the results are. Chances are someone has run into the problems that you have in the past. Usually, like the stuff that I'm doing in Houdini, I'm convinced like 5 people in the world are actually doing that. That's way harder. But I also, since I was on like a little bit more of a tech side of stuff with working with tools and shaders and all that, I usually can troubleshoot stuff a little better than like just any other artist, I suppose. I've spent a lot of time doing that and would help people all the time at BGS when there was problems.
No, I didn't realize that Houdini was used. I guess in theory it could be used to make games too, because to me that was always effects software. Like that was stuff like big AAA companies used for the Spider-Man movies and the MCU movies and all that stuff. Like they're huge effects houses that use that. but like you use it to actually make video games. What do you use it specifically for in your game?
You can use it for a lot of different stuff, but the way I'm using it is mostly for terrain generation and placement of assets. So you can like, what I ended up doing is like building a sort of simple bad model of the world. And then I bring that into Houdini and run like erosion simulations and stuff on it. So you can make the mountains and where the rock falls and where water collects and all of that, and then bring that into Unreal. And you can even tell it like, hey, put trees here based on where the water is, or creature spawns, things like that. But other people go way further and they make like whole generators for art. Like I think it was that game, The Ascent. There was a really small team, but they have like pipe generators where you can like just draw like a line and it'll make pipes or entire rooms, buildings. Like that Matrix demo that they built, that one heavily used Houdini to generate buildings and place everything.
Yeah, I didn't realize that you could use it for that, because I'd been around it in my time in the film industry, but I didn't realize. But I guess it's all software, right? And it all, as long as Unreal takes the file, like I guess you just use it. Is it common to use this stuff in games, or is it becoming more common as the Unreal and Houdini talk more to each other?
I think it's getting a little bit more common, but it's definitely like one of those like 5 to 10% kind of artists are even would want to do it, because it's such a wildly different way of working where it's all, you know, nodes based. You're not just like sitting there sculpting in ZBrush where it's like all naturalistic, or the VR sculpting that I do. That is super easy to pick up. Houdini, on the other hand, it's like 8-hour tutorial to even understand what you're looking at. It's
a
this
new
whole
tool.
other ball
It's a new
game.
tool for your toolbox. Yeah, I mean, that's what state-of-the-art technology is. Or when new technology starts to surface, everyone has to learn it. And I feel like that's one of the things all game developers are always having to do, is relearn everything. If it's not software, it's hardware being released every 6 months that you have to test for and optimize for and make sure it works. People think that PC get the shaft a lot of times when there's ports, but the truth of the matter is that there's only like 2 Xboxes, but there's thousands of PC builds. So it's actually a lot more difficult, because not everyone's going to have a 380, a 390 Ti. Some people are going to have a 360. Some people are going to have a 980. Like it's a nightmare in terms of like, I'm so glad I don't work in optimization. It's a lot of work.
Yeah, that's going to be certainly interesting doing that like on the indie scale, especially doing something that's like UE5 where it's sort of cutting edge. But that's also another reason I like stylized the game the way I did. It's like I'm doing all those high poly sculpts and stuff, but then I'm actually not using any textures and stuff. So in most cases, I just strip that off entirely. So I'm hoping that I can have like lower end graphics card work with it, because it can theoretically scale the amount of geometry it's showing to whatever. And I'm sure that will get a lot more optimized by the time I come out. And that's pretty nice, because when I actually went through, for a while, my build actually still had all those textures, but I wasn't doing anything with them. I was just like overriding them with flat colors. And I was like, well, I should just go delete these. And it cut my memory usage to like 20% of what it was before. So it's a pretty big difference, but then it still looks super detailed.
Yeah, we've interviewed other game devs where they would show us a build of their game, whatever, and it's running. I mean, you're building the game and it's running in 12 frames per second, you know, because it's not about smooth frame rate at that point. It's just a matter of getting the systems in, making sure this works. Does this respond? Does this button, is everything working? Did everything compile correctly? It's a lot of work, man. And like, hats off to you for being such a small team, because it is a ton of work on your end. So much work.
Well, I feel like it's always like the main offenders when it comes to optimization. It's like too many shadow casters or a bunch of like smoke particles in front of the screen. It's like 9 times out of 10, that's what it is.
But it looks so nice. Like particles look so cool when they're on screen. Like even in After Effects, like when you're making them and like for videos and stuff, you're like, this is so cool. All these things floating in space and looks give this depth. And then I'm getting 10 frames per second. Okay, this isn't gonna work.
Yeah, maybe another 5 years we'll have like nanite for particles where you can have infinite particles. But for now, that's still like a huge problem.
Speaking of what comes next, like clearly a release date isn't even like close at the moment, but like for those who have been following along with the Axis Unseen, can you speak to like what people can expect to see next out of it?
I'm hoping to show a little bit more of the open world as I get that more solidified. Probably not the whole thing at once, since I have to build out the rest, but I would like to show a little bit more of that. But it probably will be a little bit, and that's why I'm not giving a release date yet also, is because I feel like if I give that at this point in the project, chances are I'm going to be wrong, because I keep actually beating most of my deadlines. But then it's like, oh, there's going to be some other unknowns later. So then maybe it is exactly what I think I'm shooting towards. Like, So there's this massive spread there of where it could be. So I think as I get closer to that, I'll have a better idea of what it will really be. And then I would like to say it.
Do you have plans? I mean, this, like I said, you're still in like, not even, I wouldn't call it pre-alpha. Like you're still in the middle of building this thing, but do you have plans to enter early access at all? I mean, even talk to other publishers like Epic Game Store, maybe get some of that sweet Epic Game Store money to like make your game even better, like that kind of stuff. Have you done any of that research yet?
I've thought about early access, and it probably depends on how the project goes and like how much is it to do external QA versus that, because early access is nice in one way where you get all those bug reports and stuff, but then there is lots of community management with that, which could be a big deal for a solo dev. But you mentioned like the Epic money thing, and I have applied for a mega grant, so like fingers crossed I get that. And that would be one of those things that would help me potentially like use the mega grant to get external QA, as opposed to me reading forum posts for 6 months and cutting the amount of work done that I can get done down a lot. Like it depends on what fits for the project though. Like I might just decide that it does make more sense to do early access.
I mean, you can see, for example, like with Valheim is a good example. Like that thing took off in early access, and those poor devs, you can see that they're really struggling to try to fix the game and continue to expand it, and they had to hire a team, and they're doing a good job. But yeah, I can see how you would not want to be put in that situation where it's just like, okay, now do I fix these bugs or do I expand the game? And then you just have to start hiring out, and then it just gets more. And I think the fear for a lot of devs is they stop making the game and have to basically head the production rather than be creative. And I don't think anyone like that's the double-edged sword, right? When you start being creative and have to start managing a team instead of be creative yourself, that's not what people want probably.
Yeah, it's a lot like Kickstarters where there's upsides, but it's a lot of overhead.
You promised X, Y, and Z. I know, but it's been like, I'm trying my best. Please stop yelling at me.
Oh man, especially early. Like so much can change with a game. Like you might have all sorts of plans for what you want to do, and like who knows how it's going to change or what actually ends up being fun. You could just completely change what that is.
Oh, we've seen years being a game journalist for 11 years. We've seen the gameplay trailers come out, and then a game come out, and either that game is completely changed or stuff was changed or mitigated or completely removed. It's insane. It's a long, grueling process of trial and error that people got to understand. Maybe it wasn't fun, maybe it didn't look bad. Maybe there was a complication with the software that couldn't compile on Xbox. It could be anything. Yep. And nobody understands. They're just like, well, this is stupid. Why doesn't it look this good? Well, probably because it was running on a PC build and they want it to look really nice. So they polished it.
They're always going to run it on the PC that's the best because they're always unoptimized at that point. Like I think almost people are never, I'm not going to say never, but usually that's not going to be someone lying and having like ill intentions. It's just like the nature of making a game is that it doesn't work that well, and so you're going to put it on those awesome PCs, and then later you have to actually ship it on a console that is not nearly as powerful as that. So you have to make these decisions on what to cut.
Are you planning to do your own ports? I think you might outsource that once the game's in a really good spot for you on the PC?
I think ports would make sense for me to have like an external firm do it, because I can do a lot of things like, build out this whole game and do all these things, but I've never done a port to a console. I think that would probably be outside my wheelhouse. Kind of like being a lawyer. That's another thing I'm not going to do.
They have
I'll try to do a lot, but not everything.
Yeah, they have really real rules for certification on consoles. For people who don't know, it's very odd. Like if something looks too much like a private part, they will ask you to remove it. Like weird stuff you wouldn't think. And it is unfortunate because you are an indie dev now. Some of the larger companies can get away with more stuff in cert. I think Xbox One said, requirement for cert, 30 frames per second. Fallout 4 ran 9 frames per second at some point. So like they get some leeway for the big games. But indie games, they crack down on you pretty hard. So hopefully you'll get this out there and people can actually play it. In the meantime, Nate, where can people go to support your game, find more information about it? Do you have a Discord, Twitter, website?
Yeah, you can go to my website at justperkygames.com. And I'm also on Twitter at nperkypile. And then you can follow the links there. There's links for the Discords, the TikTok, Instagram, whatever. All of that is there. So you can follow the links there. And yeah, be sure to wishlist the Axis Unseen on Steam.
Nate, thank you so much for your time today. Go check out his game on his Twitter, join his Discord, follow him on Twitter, support it, wishlist it on Steam. We can't emphasize how much that helps him enough. It gauges interest in the game. So if you like it, please wishlist it. It helps Nate tremendously in that process. So do that. We have lots of more content coming up at E6 this week. Stay tuned. We got more. Don't go anywhere. What do I say? Don't touch that dial. We're having more right now. Thanks, Nate.
No problem. See you later.